Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens. I'm the research director at the program on extremism, and this is one of our latest webinars. We've been running for a couple of months now. Today's a really exciting book talk with Arie Perliger, who has just written an incredibly important and timely book called American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism. Arie is the professor and director of the graduate program on security studies at UMass Lowell. And I think what would be useful is for you to kind of start off by telling us a little bit of the background of the book, how you got into it, the layout of the book, and we will then have a quick discussion between us. And then there's a Q&A function for all of you watching out there and listening. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see an option for Q&A. Click that, enter a question, and we will collect those. And about half an hour into our discussion, we'll start opening up to those questions. Go ahead, Arie. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to thank Alex and the program on extremism at GW for organizing this event. It's really kind of them. So basically, the idea to this book came out almost 7-8 years ago. I just around 2012, I completed a project on far-right extremism and violence in the US as part of my work at West Point at the Combating Terrorism Center. And I really felt the urge to further continuing my work on the American far-right. I felt that this will be something that will become a more substantial threat and concern, and which eventually, something that eventually materialized. So what I'd like to do for the next really 10-15 minutes is really to provide you an overview of the main insights and findings of the book. And you'll be able to see, those of you who were able to look at the book, you'll be able to see that it's really divided into two major sections. In the first section of the book, I strive to provide a broad conceptual and historical overview of the American far right. And what was really important for me was to highlight the different ideological branches of the American far right. Many people, when they think about the American far right, they think about a very homogeneous landscape. They think about a very uniform movement, but the fact is that we have many different ideological movements or branches or sectors within the American far right. And it's important to recognize that because we do see some correlation and association between the ideological elements of the different groups and their modus operandi. So we'll see that the ideology in many cases is associated with their recruitment efforts or recruitment methods, their organizational structure, target selection, the way they disseminate their propaganda, and so on and so forth. So if we really want to gain a better understanding of the modus operandi of the different groups that comprise the American far right, it's also really important to understand the ideological differences between them. I also thought it would be important to expose the reader to the history of the American far right, which didn't start, 10 years ago or 100 years ago, but was actually a presence from the early days of the Republic. And for example, when I talk with my students about the American far right, very few of them heard about the Know Nothings Party, for example, which was basically the first really white nationalist, white supremacist, anti-immigration political party in the United States. And actually many of their tactics and practices are also can be visible today. They are being employed by contemporary groups. So it was really important for me also to expose the readers to the history of the American far right, because a lot of the things that we see today originated from prior historical events and dynamics. The second part of the book is really focusing on analyzing the data that I collected about the American far right. I was able to compile a database that includes more than 5,000 incidents, and which goes really from 1990s until the last few years. And the first thing that I've tried to identify if there's any kind of factors that can explain the fluctuation in the level of violence of the American far right. And one of the things that I was able to identify very quickly is that during election times, there's actually an increase in the level of violence, which is not overly surprising. People during election times are more receptive to political messages, including very radical and militant political messages. The environment in general is more contentious. And finally, from a political perspective, election times are very competitive. So there's actually some kind of an incentives to some groups to engage in more militant, violent activities in order to distinguish themselves from the crowd. Also, during election times, there's more resources for activism. Political bodies, political parties really streamline more resources to activists, so they have more ability to engage in different elements of political activism. And finally, I think that, and this is something that is probably more unique to the American far right, is the fact that during election times, I think many far-right activists really recognize the fact that they have very limited influence on political processes, on the political system, and they are more. And this frustration eventually leads them to engage in more militant activities. By the way, this may explain why, actually, in 2016, in contrast to our expectation, we actually see decline in the level of far-right violence. My argument is that because they actually see their views and opinions being manifested in Trump's campaign. So again, so this level of frustration will actually decline a bit. But again, overall, we do see rise of violence during election times. We also see, by the way, a rise in the level of violence since 2016. And I think that is mainly results of a sense of empowerment that many of them feel. They have perceptions that law enforcement are more tolerant to their views and to their activities. And mainly, I think they are more empowered and they feel higher levels of political efficacy because they feel that their views are gaining more representation in the legitimate political discourse. And this element of empowerment is really important, because we also see that in other cases when we are trying to explain changes in the level of violence. For example, one of the things that I find in the book and talk about in the book is that we see more anti-abortion violence after pro-life decisions of the American Supreme Court. Again, they see that that these views get more legitimacy and support, so they feel more empowered to engage in more militant and violent activism. Another element which is really important if we're really trying to understand fluctuation in the level of violence is looking at demographic and social factors. So for example, one of the things that I find is that there's a direct correlation between the diversity of the state and the level of violence. More diverse states are actually experiencing higher levels of violence, which means that we actually see more violence in blue states rather than in red states, which are, for the most part, less diverse. And that means that, you know, many people perceive the South as the main hotbed of white supremacy. That's not the case anymore. When you're looking at the distribution, the geographic distribution of attacks, you really see how the blue states are really are on the top. More specifically, we see correlation between the size of various minority populations and the level of violence. So African Americans, Hispanic, and Asian Americans. Even more specifically, the best predictors of level of violence on the state level is actually the increased rate in the portion of Asian Americans and Hispanic populations. And my argument is that the reason for that is because these communities are being perceived as the main competitors in the job market, in terms of upwards socioeconomic mobilization, and so on. Asian American and Hispanic are now more and more being perceived as the main threat, and they get more attention, and we see this kind of very clear correlation between the size or the increase in the size of these populations and the state level violence. The fact is, however, our country is becoming more and more diverse. The United States is becoming more and more diverse, and that probably means that we'll continue to see increase in the level of violence. The diversity combined with the sense of empowerment, combined with the increasing political polarizations, are all the ingredients that are necessary in order to see continuous increase in the level of violence. I also try to identify if different elements within the American far right have different tactics, different modus operandi, and there's not a lot of surprises, although there's some really interesting findings. So there's a clear association between the ideology of the group and the target selection of its members. So as we would expect, anti-government organizations, militias, and so on are more inclined to operate against proxies of the federal government, while more white supremacy groups, more racist groups, and so on are more inclined to operate against minorities. Two things that I want to emphasize is, first of all, that we see a rise in attacks against religious sites. And this is something that is really evident when you look at the data, and I provide in the book the data and the charts and everything. And when we are trying to explain why this is the case, I think it's a combination of several factors. First of all, the increase in religious discourse within the American far right. When religious discourse become more and more amplified, that also impact eventually target selection. I also think that many of these perpetrators feel that the potential cost or the sanctions are less significant when they attack property and sites, especially as more and more states basically are employing hate crimes legislation and more harsh punishments. Many of these activists feel that attacking property, especially synagogue, mosque, and so on, eventually it's less risky, in other words. Also, I think we need to look into the potential backlash against the rise of some minority groups and their representatives. So again, there were a lot of activists that, when you look at their discourse on their message boards and websites, they talk about the need to counter the growing presence of American Islamic leaders and so on. Another interesting element is the fluctuation in the level of attacks or number of attacks against members of the LGBTQ community. This is more difficult to explain. So we actually see between 2009 and 2013 a increase in the level of violence. And my sense is that the growing discourse about gay marriage was one of the main reasons. It was at that time, it was at the center of the political discourse and sucked a lot of attention. But once that was basically settled by the American Supreme Court, probably the attention to LGBTQ issues declined a bit, and we see a decline in the level of violence. It's also important to emphasize that LGBTQ is mainly victims of skinheads and some other white supremacy groups. It's not something that characterizes all the different groups within the American far right. And finally, one thing that I've tried to explain is why, on average, okay, I want to emphasize that, on average, the American far right shows low levels of tactical sophistication. The great majority of their attacks do not produce the same level of damage and fatalities as we see in other types of terrorism. I think there's, again, like always, there's multiple factors that are responsible for that. First of all, I think that many of them see themselves still as part of the American collective, and they're really reluctant to engage in operations that can completely delegitimize them and in the eyes of most Americans. I also think that the fact that many of them are concerns about the cost that are more direct also plays a role. And I elaborate that when I'm talking about my iceberg theory in the book. But I think these are probably the two main factors that are responsible for that. Also, again, many of them are really interested in minimizing or reducing the potential cost for their actions, something that also I think leads many of them to engage in not so sophisticated operations. Then I move and I talk about the individual perpetrators of American far-right violence. And one of the things that I do is really emphasize the fact that there's some socioeconomic factors that facilitate involvement in radical activism, but that also is combined with some demographic and political factors. most perpetrators of the far right have high levels of biographical availability. That means that they have very limited commitments in terms of career, or most of them are single and so on. And also, they're not part of the higher socioeconomic echelons. And another interesting finding there is that many of the perpetrators of these attacks are actually what we can define as spontaneous perpetrators. That means that many of these attacks are not pre-planned. They're not the results of a ongoing planning and preparations and collecting intelligence, etc. And there's different ways to explain that, but I think it's a part of the fact that, again, many of them are reluctant to engage in more sophisticated operations. Many of them are more inclined to engage in operations where they feel that they cannot be identified as part of a broader group, right? So there's still significant stigma on being part of a KKK or another white supremacy groups, and many of them prefer not to be part of these groups. Nonetheless, they still feel the urge to express their views in situations where they are being triggered to express these views. And I provide more elaboration in the book. One of the interesting things that we see is that spontaneous attacks are more prevalent in affluent areas, where we have actually lower levels of minority populations. And I'm guessing is that because of the scarcity of potential targets in these kind of areas, it diminishes the motivation to engage in long-term planning and to create some kind of a more formal groups. And also, many of these individuals feel uncomfortable to present their views in this kind of, again, high socioeconomic area, something that, again, also contribute to the spontaneous nature of their attacks. And finally, I want to say a few words about the discourse. So one chapter of the book really is utilizing more than 300 primary sources, basically communications of far-right activists from the different groups. My team and I, we collected more than 300 primary sources from their message boards, websites, personal communications, and so on, in order really to understand what really characterized the contemporary discourse of the far right. And we were able to identify several interesting dynamics or changes. First of all, there's a growing preference to focus on cultural and normative differences rather than on primordial attributes. So the rhetoric now seems to be more focusing on justification, which is mainly based on the need to preserve specific cultural and religious norms and practices, rather than some kind of a genetic purity or racial purity. This is what also facilitates the globalizations of the far right, because since you start talking about a cultural narrative and religious ones, you can actually cross borders and find areas of cooperation with similar groups in other countries, in other parts of the globe. Another element that we see increasing is what we can define as a rhetoric that's focusing on masculine exclusiveness. So growing parts of the far right are becoming more and more motivated to support and to promote what we can define as an ideological misogynist violence. Many of them also see that as a great tool for recruitment. And so we see this kind of language, misogynist language, really more proliferating within their message boards and website. And finally, I think that many of them also tend to adopt a more global perspective and especially broaden their areas of interest. So if you look at the mission statements of many of the contemporary groups, you'll see that they are focusing on what I define as economic patriotism. That means protecting small businesses and protecting what they define as protecting the American economy. There's much more discourse about eco-politics and about foreign policy. So many of them, for example, criticizing Trump about his close connections with Israel, for example. So we see that many of these groups trying really to broaden their discourse as part of their attempt to mainstream their message and to be more attractive to a broader part of the public. Many of them also, and mainly the racist groups, also have a strong response to the emergence of what they see as left-wing militancy. They also tend to elevate contemporary heroes, quote unquote, such as Zimmerman and so on. And again, as I mentioned before, many of them also adopt more religious and fundamentalist language. And we also see, especially in the last few years, more and more of them start to think about how can they really create segregated communities. In other words, they feel that they cannot really win the American people. They will never be able to gain any kind of substantial electoral support. So their solution is actually, instead of trying to transform American society, isolate themselves, basically going back to the ideas of some more veteran far-right ideologists about basically creating compounds or creating areas that will be basically exclusive for white Americans. I can continue talking about the discourse, but I really would like to give some time to questions from Alex and from the audience. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Arie. I have a lot of questions, of course, which I'll run through a couple now. And in the meantime, while we're talking, just to remind those listening, at the bottom there is a Q&A option where if you click it, you can enter your question, and we'll try to get it to Arie via me. So feel free to enter some questions in there while we're chatting. So I'll kind of start where you left off in terms of I'll work my way back. You mentioned, and a bigger question for me is what you think about the so-called alt-right and where that fits in here. That came up in my mind because you mentioned that a lot of the discourse today does try to move away from things that society has become largely, not completely, but somewhat inoculated against. That is sort of very obvious racism, obvious anti-Semitism, sort of race nationalism. And you mentioned they've moved to a more palatable cultural, what we can maybe call cultural nationalism to some extent. And we saw that in Europe. We saw that a lot in Europe, maybe even before the US. Groups like the English Defense League and other kind of anti-Islam right-wing groups were very much trying to present themselves as the protectors of liberal values and of liberal democracy against what they presented as the kind of fascist theocracy of Islam. And they used all these kind of terminology to try to deflect away from what possibly was still a deep-rooted racism. But so my question there is, the assumption has been actually that a lot of the right-wing stuff is starting to come back towards the race nationalism through the alt-right, the kind of more like the Unite the Right rally, right? The sort of white supremacism seems to have actually come back to the fold a bit more. But you mentioned that actually you're seeing the opposite. So I wondered what you thought about all that.
So I'll just say that, first of all, a quick anecdote. Some of the conspiracy theories that I read almost 8-10 years ago, and were basically were part of the discourse of the more extreme groups of the American far right, are now finding themselves into the mainstream political discourse. So this is a concerning trend. But I think it's part, when you're talking about the alt-right, we're really talking about the attempts of many of these groups to mainstream their message and their ideological propaganda. So they're adopting many of the relatively new cultural political trends that's proliferating within the American rights. For example, there's a lot of discourse about how institutions of higher education are basically hijacking young Americans and try to indoctrinate them to adopt left-wing liberal ideas. There's also a lot of discourse about the damage and threat of globalist tendencies, right? About how these globalist policies eventually undermine nationalist views, ideas, policies, practices, etc. So I think what we see in the alt-right is basically many main figures and some of these groups trying to think how they can really play into the existing discourse, right? So there's an ongoing discourse how much the US, for example, should be involved in various dynamics over the globe, including foreign conflict, etc., and so on. And by the way, they are extremely critical even on Trump because of his tendency to get involved in these kind of foreign foreign policies, especially in the context of Israel, but also in other contexts. So, for example, they were very critical about all the efforts that he put into the deal with, or the attempted deal with North Korea. You saw a bunch of posts, for example, of why he's wasting time on reaching a deal with North Korea. We shouldn't care about it. This is not why we elected him, right? So I think it's part of their attempt really to broaden their ideological framework in order really to position themselves in a more mainstreaming, more legitimate position. And the alt-right is mainly an extension of it, right? It's basically how we can basically formulate these ideas in a way that will gain some kind of legitimacy and will be able to penetrate the mainstream discourse that until then basically rejected these ideas. And we see that also in other manifestations, you know, with QAnon and others. We see how many of these conspiracy theories, many of these views are gradually penetrating the political system. And this is something that it's not a new thing. You know, in the 20s and the 30s of the previous century, you know, many democratic governors, many democratic politicians were members of the KKK. So it's not the first time where we see this kind of dynamics, but it's really important to be aware of what is going on. And that also make them naturally more effective in terms of recruitment and mobilizing support and attracting young Americans. And they're very, very sensitive to the issues that they feel can really attract new recruits. This is why they, for example, they emphasize a lot the issues of masculinity, or the declining masculinity of what they define as the Western white male, right? Basically taking Breivik's words and using that again and again to emphasize that they are the destination of every white man that feels that his status is being threatened.
Yeah, or ignored or disrespected.
Exactly.
So you, despite the kind of isolationist foreign policy views that they have, and which is a kind of strain of conservative thought right up through the mainstream, and it kind of it moves its way to it's kind of something that a lot of conservatives share of some type of. But despite that, you do talk about the international component of this of the I suppose we call it the terror threat that they provide. So I wondered if you could shed a bit more light on this, how this international or internationalism manifests itself. What does it look like? How does it compare to, say, what we understand international terrorist groups to be, which is quite different? I think, you know, if we think Al Qaeda as an international network, this I would say we would say is not the same, but there is definitely an emerging international component. I wonder how big that really is and what it looks like, I suppose.
So I'll just say as a side note that significant portions of the American far right actually originated outside the US and basically were imported to the US. When you're talking about the neo-Nazis, when you're talking about skinheads, when you're talking about Christian identity, all these white supremacy movements actually began in Europe. And at some point they were basically brought or were basically appeared in the US as well. So there's, you know, in a very fundamental way, there's a lot of international aspects to the ideology of the American far right. I would say that there was always an aspiration and desire by some of the American far right groups to gain hold also abroad, basically to collaborate, to forge connections and collaborations with similar groups abroad. The Hammerskins Nation, which was the most important skinheads organization in the 90s, they created branches in many European countries, as well as in other Anglo-Saxon parts of the globe, such as Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So there was always this kind of aspiration to gain some kind of global presence and global influence. But for the most part, I think that the interactions are mainly basically on the ideological level. They're sharing ideas. Sometimes they share some, you know, practices and norms, but we cannot really say that we do see the emergence of something which is equivalent to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, something which is a really global network. Yes, the far right has its own foreign fighters, you know, and you know, the Sufan Center did a good job of tracking, you know, Proud Boys activists that travel to Ukraine to participate in the war in eastern Ukraine, and there's some other attempts. There's also sometimes joint events, especially white power music festivals and events where you do see some kind of collaboration. But something which is equivalent to what we see on the jihadi side, I don't think we're there yet. It's also important to emphasize the fact that there's some kind of an internal discrepancy or internal conflict. On one hand, they despise the ideas of globalism, and they really oppose and criticize policies that's supposed to promote globalizations, or that's supposed to erode nationalists' sentiments and practices. And on the other hand, they do try to create some kind of a global framework. So they always struggle a little bit, you know, between these two contradicting, I guess, vectors of on one hand, yes, we want to be also relevant outside the US. On the other hand, eventually we are, you know, they are nationalists. Now, the transition to more cultural nationalism, white nationalism, it's a result of this kind of contradiction forces. So basically, they define their constituency differently now. So they're not just talking about white Americans; they're talking about whites in general. And they, you know, and they draw a lot of similarities between the dynamics, demographic dynamics that we see in Europe, to the demographic dynamics that we see in the US. So, for example, this is mainly popular among leaders of Christian identity groups, basically focusing on how the demographic changes in Europe impacted Europe, and how we see similar dynamics, for example, in the US, something that allowed them to be more critical about immigration policies and so on.
Very good, thank you. So we've got a bunch of questions come in. I'm just going to read them off here or have a look, so forgive me if I'm looking away. First one, can you speak to how white supremacists have adapted during the pandemic? Did you see if they were more active in recruiting online as more and more people spent more time at home and online? That's a question that has been coming up a lot. Some people considering maybe that's been overblown. Others have said that is a pretty significant thing. This question, really wanted to get your thoughts on that.
So I think it was a good opportunity for some of the far right groups, especially those who are focusing on opposition to the federal government. I'm talking about anti-government groups such as the 3%ers, such as the Oath Keepers, because the dynamics, the policy dynamics that are associated with the COVID-19 played into their argument that we see a growing intrusion of the federal government into their lives, its sphere, the fact that the federal government is trying to gain more and more power and more influence, and the fact that their constitutional rights are being threatened by the federal government. So all these groups were able basically to play into all this public discourse about the usage of masks and some other elements, and to politicize that really. So they really politicize public health for their own reason. Naturally, you know, when everybody's are quarantined, people are more active online, which means that, you know, probably they have more access to individuals who may be attracted to their views. One thing I want to emphasize is that we don't really have data about this right now, and because it's still happening, right? And I think that it's really important, and I'm sure that some people are working on right now on looking into, you know, the level of activities in various online forums, far-right online forums, and to see if indeed we see actually a rise in the level of activities. On the other hand, it also, I think, emphasized how much the infrastructure of the far right is really completely moved into the online sphere. Like many other sectors, such as the academic sector, also the infrastructure of the American far right basically was already extremely active online, but it's further encouraged many of these groups really to move and to further intensify their presence in the online sphere. But the fact is that we don't really have data if they were more successful in terms of mobilizing support or recruitment. You know, there's a lot of thoughts and there's a lot of pieces out there. Maybe I missed something, but I haven't seen an actual data that support that. These are right now, these are assumptions. These are, you know, they make sense, but we'll need to see how that plays. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And this is actually a question that's very interesting for me as well. It's a two-part question. The second part particularly interesting to me. Have you looked at the potential, and you touched on this a little bit actually, have you looked at the potential of these various groups working together? And the second part of this, what role does accelerationism play in uniting these disparate groups? And this term, accelerationism, a lot has been made of it in the recent year, really over the last year or two. There's a bit of a debate going on. I keep kind of changing my mind about whether or not it's a real kind of new thing or if it's a repackaging of what is standard terrorist and extremist operate or strategies. Is there something to that, to the accelerationism question? Is too much being made of it? Can we understand them through this prism? So that's two-part question. Can they work together? What role does accelerationism perhaps play in uniting them?
So first of all, I'll say that there's a lot of overlap in terms of membership. So most of the members of these groups are active in multiple groups. So the fact that you're a member of a militia group doesn't mean that you'll not join some events of a white supremacy group. So we see a significant overlap. And many of these groups actually encourage this kind of overlap. They don't try to I guess, limit their members from engaging in multiple types of activities. I also think that we see more and more joint events such as, you know, a United Right parade and some other events. But these are something that, these are not new. You know, when you're looking at many of the White Power rock festival and concerts, these are basically hubs where all the members of the different groups can congregate and sharing ideas and sharing different types of practices and get to know each other and planning, you know, future events. On the operational side, we do see occasionally some collaboration, but this is much more rare. As for accelerationism, apologies for my accent. Here, I actually I'm on the skeptic side. I'm studying militant, radical extremist groups for a long time, and for the most part, all of them want to expedite some political, social processes in order to basically achieve their objectives, which in many cases demand changes in the political system, in the social structure, and so on. Basically, all religious fundamentalist groups have some kind of ideological vision that talks about accelerating political processes and social process in order for them to achieve their objectives. If you're looking into anti-colonial groups, also, we're talking about ideologies that are focusing on accelerating specific national discourse or a national movement in order to basically being able to achieve their objectives. So most of the extremist groups adopt this idea that there's a need to expedite and to move more quickly in order to establish their goals. And they believe that utilization of violence is an important tool that allows them to accelerate the process of political and economic changes. Now, the pushback that I get many times is that they're focusing mainly on basically leading to some kind of a civil war or some kind of an apocalypse and so on. But apocalyptic visions are a long time component of many radical groups and militant groups. So this is also not something new. And this also is part of a broader perception that I hold, that we really need to be very careful in the creating of new conceptualizations and new concepts. we already, the field of security and terrorism studies already have a lot of very confusing conceptual frameworks. And I understand that there's a desire, there's new scholars, new people that want to present new concept, which is important. But we really need to be sure that we're not just reinventing the wheel again and again. And again, I understand that there are two sides for this argument, and I'm guessing that at least half of the people on the chat will disagree with me, which is perfectly fine. I just wasn't able to be convinced yet that what we see is really something new and not something which is a component that existed for a long time now among many different types of militant groups.
Yes, that has been my sense. As I said, I keep kind of shifting. And, there's a lot of researchers, writers on this event right now. Arie remains to be convinced, but we're still, I'd love to be convinced. So if someone could write something new on that to give us an understanding of what's the uniqueness here.
And again, it's part of the fun of, of being engaged in this academic discourse. Disagreements are great because they force us to think and rethink our views and our dispositions. So yeah, I'm not saying that this is not something that should be continued to be researched and analyzed, but again, I think it's still an open debate, and I'm more than happy to listen to people that think otherwise.
Yes. This comes from Cynthia Miller-Idris. Hi, Arie. Really enjoyed your remarks. Can't wait to read the book. I wanted to ask you about your sense that misogynistic comments, male supremacy, ideology are increasing. Can you talk a bit more about the evidence that it's increasing as opposed to just being better recognized? So is it being just more recognized, or is it actually on the increase? So many violent male supremacist extremists were not initially recognized as part of the far right, for example, but increasingly are understood as part of the spectrum. I don't doubt that it's increasing, just wondering about what you're seeing. And to what extent are you seeing those developments as global, or is there something uniquely North American about the male supremacist dimensions?
So I'm actually working about this a little bit in the last few weeks. And when I'm trying to understand the landscape of what I define, but this is, again, that's my definition, as misogynist ideological violence, is that there's three main types of groups or types of actors that are really engaged in this kind of violence. First of all are the incels, which everybody is familiar with. And most of them are basically are members of online and misogynistic forums that promote this kind of masculine exclusiveness and hatreds and animosity towards symbols of feminism and women empowerment and so on. So this is one set of actors. There's also many far-right groups who basically are trying to utilize this growing movement in order to expand their membership. And what you see is that I definitely identify increase in the I guess direct usage of this kind of anti-feminist rhetoric in the language of many of those groups. So when I started looking into their websites and so on in 2010, 11, 12, there was a masculine subculture. For example, the KKK refused to admit women for a long time, and many other groups also had a very strong anti-women sentiments and anti-feminist sentiments, but it was never used in such, it was never that prevalent, that emphasized. And actually I was able also to get access to some of the internal communications of some of the groups. So for example, Works Front, one of the skinhead groups, where the leaders actually emphasizing the need to elevate the discourse about the oppression of the white male because they feel that this can be an important recruitment method. So in many ways, this seems to be not just a bottom-up process, but also a top-bottom process in some of these groups. They just feel that these males are potential reservoirs of future recruits. Now, I think that we also see similar dynamics also in the Western world, in the European world, but I'm not sure about a more developing countries. I haven't looked into that, so I need to be careful. Before I forget, the third group that actually utilize what I define as ideological misogynist violence is Orthodox religious fundamentalist communities. And what they share with the far right and some of the incel perpetrators is the fact that they also use violence against women as a political instrument to maintain a rigid gender roles in order to maintain the privileged status of males within these communities. So you can see in a lot of these Orthodox communities, significant violence against women for the same reasons, because they feel threatened or their masculinity is being feel threatened. And I think that's another element that is being shared by all these actors, is that the more they feel that their masculinity or the privilege that their masculinity provides are being threatened, what we see is really a pushback. And I truly believe that way more research needs to be done about this element, this frame or angle of the far right, because it will be very, very prominent, I believe, in the next few years. And we already see that there's more efforts. I know that there's multiple great scholars who are now focusing on this element of the far right ideology.
Thank you. So this is an inevitable question. That's I often find a difficult one to answer, and maybe you'll be better than me at it. In studying the far right discourse and their current objectives, targeting misogynist arenas, playing to the underdog, etc., how do you envision a counter discourse? What should a counter message, counter rhetoric look like? What would you recommend for individual communities in the US in terms of their response to such a far right threat, should they find themselves targeted? So the counter messaging, the inevitable counter messaging question, important, but also complicated.
This is a difficult question, especially as we're dealing with open societies and democracies. Eventually, the only way to ensure that the misogynist, racist, the hate discourse is not proliferating is by basically presenting a much more reliable and attractive alternatives. You cannot, there's so much you can do in terms of limiting their ability to spread and to express their views, especially as, we have various legal mechanisms that are supposed to protect the freedom of speech. So we can drop many of their Facebook groups, and we can limit their ability to communicate through Telegram or 4chan or 8chan, but they'll be able to continue to spread their ideology. So I think what we really need to think about, how we can create an alternative discourse, which will be much more effective in exposing the limitations of their ideology, exposing all the deficiencies of these ideologies. There's no, I don't think that if you really want to monopolize a discourse, there's any other way to do it. Eventually, you need to be sure that you do the best efforts in the marketplace of ideas. I'm not talking about more operational sides of counterterrorism or counter-extremism, which should be done. Anyone who engage in violence, engage in incitement to violence, need to be dealt through the legal system, through the criminal justice system. But if we're talking about the war of ideas, here we really need to just operate. We have no choice but to operate in the same arena. And I know it is difficult, because eventually when you're talking about political violence, for the most part, the struggle is over who control and dominate the discourse. Look, far-right groups are not an existential threat, not yet at least. They still have limited resources, limited manpower, limited capabilities. However, their main advantage is that they can operate relatively freely in the public domain in terms of disseminating their ideas. And this is where we need to meet them, and we understand that this is where the war is happening. And we need to find ways to communicate with those reservoir of recruits and provide them a different, better alternative. Just operating on the offensive side of just trying to block them again and again, that has some utility in the short term. I'm not sure if it's in the long term. So this is where I stand, and I know that there's already multiple organizations and enterprise that are actually working on this. So
yeah, it's fundamentally the question of changing what and perhaps how people think, and that's it's not really clear there's a straight answer to that, or if there should be, if the government has a role. But we've had those discussions many times. So this is more on the question of more technical question on financing. I wondered if you had any insight, or the book discussed it. To what extent are you aware of the financial needs of these groups in the U.S.? How are they funding their activities? I know in the past you had the music bands that were selling merchandise and things like this. I wonder if is it similar today?
So I think that, again, I think it's for many of their activities, they really don't need a lot of resources. I'll just say that when you're talking about try to dismantle and undermine some of these groups, what was proven very effective in the past were actually civil lawsuits. So for example, the Aryan Nations, which was one of the most prominent white supremacy organizations in the 80s, 90s, eventually was dismantled after they lost a $6 million lawsuit because some of the members shot a mother and a son who by mistake arrived too close to their compound. And similar initiatives were also executed against WAR, that Thomas Metzger's organizations, the White Aryan Resistance, also an organization that had basically to be dismantled because they lost multiple lawsuits. So when we're talking about the more formalized, the more institutionalized organizations, hitting them on their finance can be a good possibility, a good option. But when you're talking about many of those new contemporary organizations that are extremely decentralized, that really don't have too much formal bodies and formal organizations, in this case, it's much more challenging to hit them on the financial side. And yes, white power music is still a significant source of income. Many of them have their own music labels, and they are able through that not just to gain income, but also to connect very effectively with a lot of youth. And when you look at the expansion of many of these groups, many of them were able to expand because they were able to utilize those white power music festivals and concert and events and so on. So this is still a significant source of income. Also, there's a lot of memorabilia's industry that is very active, which also represent a source of income. Some of them, not too many, also have these kind of membership fees and donations, but that's usually provide very limited income to these groups.
Interesting, thanks. And so our last question from a mutual friend, Professor Bruce Hoffman. Thanks for joining. What's your assessment of the Boogaloo movement, and how does it fit into your analysis of the violent far right in the U.S.?
So I think the Boogaloo movement, in many ways, it's almost a combination of sovereign citizen and other extremist anti-government organizations that really adopted what we can define as a very strong beliefs in an alternative sets of facts or realities. For example, they adopted from the sovereign citizen the belief about the existence of a parallel set of laws and financial system and legal system. They adopted the decentralized nature of the sovereign citizens and some of the anti-government groups. They also adopted their their tendency to really utilize and to exploit existing polarizing issues within the American political discourse in order to elevate their presence, to elevate their visibility. Again, I haven't studied closely the Boogaloo movement, but my sense is that many of them are basically members of existing militias that utilize the dynamics of COVID-19 and the response to police brutality in order to gain some kind of a new, to create a new type of social framework that allows them to be more visible, allows them to be more active, and look, they're using the same practices that, such as, like, one of the common practices of organizations such as the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers is showing up everywhere where there is a conflict between federal agents or federal authorities and the public. So they joined Bundy when he was in a conflict with the land management agencies agents. They show up almost everywhere where there's a conflict with the federal government. Similarly, we can say that the Boogaloo movement, in many cases, utilizing all these cases where there's some conflict, some contentious environment, to basically to show up their support, to show up their presence, and to elevate their visibility. So, to conclude, I see them as some kind of a maybe temporary, maybe more constant extension of existing anti-government radical organizations, some kind of a combination of the sovereigns and the more traditional militia groups. But again, I think when we are trying to assess the threat from the Boogaloo movement, so far there were some plots and there were some attempts, but so far we don't see any consistent attempt to engage in an ongoing campaign of violence. We see a campaign of protest. We still haven't seen, again, there were a few cases of some members of the movement who were planning to engage in active, but in terms as a movement that really support, mobilize resources to sustain such a campaign, I don't see it yet, but again, this may change in the foreseeable future.
Great, thanks, Arie. And yeah, I think a lot of open questions with that Boogaloo movement, and interesting. And I don't know if too much was made of it, but shots of them involved in the Black Lives Matter protests as part of their anti-police positions. Some interesting relationship possibly there. Well, thanks a lot again, Professor Perliger. His book, American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism, on sale now, published by Columbia University Press. Very highly recommend it. Thanks again. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Want more information about the GW program on extremism? Our Twitter is @GWUPOE, and website extremism.gwu.edu. Thanks again, Arie. Thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.